I'm going to start, just give an opportunity first for Mr. Atkinson to kind of share what he's been doing and kind of his career, how he got started, and then we'll start hearing some of your questions. So.
Okay, thanks, Mrs. Olson. Thank you, kids, for having me here today. What a great school you go to. I'm really very impressed. So I've spent my whole adult life as a writer. First for newspapers. I started on a small paper in Kansas right out of school, out of graduate school. And then I moved to a bigger paper in Kansas City, and then I moved to the Washington Post in Washington, D.C. And I worked there for almost 20 years as a reporter, as an editor, as a foreign correspondent, as a war correspondent. I lived in Berlin, in Germany, for several years as a correspondent. And I live in Washington, D.C. now, and I've lived there for more than 40 years. For the past 25 years, I've not had a day job. I just write books. I'd written a couple of books when I would take leave from the newspaper, and then I'd come back to my day job as at the newspaper, but for 25 years, I've just been writing books. I'm now working on book number 9. This is book number 8. It's the second volume in a trilogy, as Mrs. Olson said, about the American Revolution. And all of the books that I write are about war. They're all about American wars. And I do that in part because I grew up in an Army family. My father was an Army officer. We moved around a lot. So I was interested in it from the time I was a kid, interested in the military. And then when I was a newspaper reporter, I wrote about military things a lot. I covered wars a lot in Somalia, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, Bosnia. So it was a fairly natural step for me to move from writing about war for newspapers to doing it about books. We're going to move to your questions in a minute because that'll be much more interesting than anything I have to say. As Mrs. Olson said, for the first time, I've been involved in the making of a graphic edition of this book, the first volume of my American Revolution trilogy. And I read comic books all the time when I was a kid. This is different. It's pitched to readers in maybe late junior high, high school, even early college. But the first of the graphic editions will be out in June. So we're almost done. It's been very interesting for me to watch the process. So I'll stop there and we'll just talk about whatever you want to talk about. What a good question, Thomas. We all like to think we'd be on the winning side, right? We all like to think that we would have been rebel patriots because they won, and what we have today, 250 years later, comes directly from what they did. It's hard to tell, it's hard to put yourself back in the shoes of those who were around. In America, in say 1775, when the American Revolution began at Lexington and Concord, there were 2.5 million people in America. 500,000 of them were enslaved blacks. So 1 out of every 5 people living in the 13 colonies was a slave. Of the 2 million white people in America at that time, and that includes people in New England, New York, and farther south, we now know scholarship shows that about 20% of them were loyalists, meaning they believed that the country should remain loyal to King George III, our last king. They were against armed rebellion against their lawful government. And some of them took up arms against the Patriots. There were tens of thousands of loyalists who fought for the crown, for the king at the time. My ancestors, they were Quakers. They were driven out of England in the late 17th century. They settled in Bucks County, just north of Philadelphia. And Quakers then and now are against war. And they will generally not participate in war to the extent that many of them refuse to pay taxes to support war. What my direct forebears in 1775 were doing, I don't know. I know that they were north of Philadelphia. My guess is, like so many people in so many wars, they were just trying to stay out of the way. I like to think that, if I'd been around, I would have been like, there were Quakers, like a general named Nathaniel Greene, who was from Rhode Island. He was a lapsed Quaker, and he became second only to George Washington as the most important general in the Continental Army. And I like to think that I would have been a Nathaniel Greene kind of Quaker, would have put aside my religious scruples to participate in the cause. Great question.
If you could meet a person in the book, who would you meet and why?
Oh, another great question. If I could meet someone in the book, who would I meet and why? The New York Times asked me when this book came out in April, when this second book came out, if I was throwing a dinner party and could invite any three people, living or dead, who would I invite? First on my list would be Benjamin Franklin. Now, I write about war, and I'm a military historian, so you might think Washington, or I just mentioned Nathaniel Greene, or Henry Knox. We'll talk about him in a minute. But Benjamin Franklin was the most famous American of his day because of his scientific discoveries in the 1740s and 50s, when he was a relatively young man. His experiments with electricity, words that we use today like battery and voltage and positive and minus when you're talking about electricity, those all come from Benjamin Franklin. He was also a writer. He'd started as a printer. He was born in Boston, but he settled in Philadelphia, so he was really a Philadelphian. And then he was our first and greatest diplomat. In 1776, the end of 76, he was sent to France, crossing the Atlantic Ocean. He was in his 70s then, which is really old for that time. He crossed the Atlantic and went to Paris as the American representative to the court at Versailles, the French king, Louis XVI. And Franklin's job on behalf of Congress was to persuade the French, and they were Roman Catholic. It was an absolute monarchy. He didn't have to pay any attention to Congress or a parliament or anybody else. An absolute monarch is the boss. And Franklin's job was to persuade Louis XVI to send an army and a navy, provide gunpowder and muskets, artillery to the American cause. He ultimately was successful. He was our first and our greatest diplomat ever. So I think if I could sit down over a beer or at lunch with one person from that time, it would be Franklin.
Did any of the tea get saved from the Boston Tea Party?
Did any of the tea get saved from the Boston Tea Party? No, very little, maybe a few flakes. It was more than 40 tons of tea. The Boston Tea Party, as some of you certainly know, was a violent protest against the British effort to impose taxes on people in America, particularly in Massachusetts, and there was a tax on tea. The British had agreed to lift most of the taxes after there'd been many protests in the 13 colonies, but the tax on tea remained in order to show that Parliament, which is the British Congress, that Parliament had the right to tax Americans. It was very little. It was 3 pence a pound, which is nothing. But the feeling was, I live in the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C. My license plate says taxation without representation, because the 800,000 people, including me, who live in the district have no representation in Congress. That's just the way it was set up. We're the only people out of 338 million in America who don't have representation in Congress. At that time, Americans had no representation in Parliament. And they said, if you're going to tax us, you've got to let us have a voice in deciding on those taxes. And when the British said, nah, I don't think so, rebels in Boston, some of them dressed as Indians, went down to where there were 3 ships that had brought large cargoes of tea to Boston, and they took the crates of tea and they threw it into Boston Harbor, famously. Almost no tea. There were a few flakes that were found in pockets, some guys who were throwing it over the side. Tea was very popular. There was no Starbucks then. So if you were going to drink a beverage, a hot beverage, it tended to be tea. So there was very little left. So more than 40 tons of tea are floating across Boston Harbor. And after the Tea Party, men in boats went around with rakes and pushed it under the water to make sure that none of it would survive. That's how angry they were about the effort to tax them without a voice. For the microphone, I'm
Is there
impressed.
anything you would like to change about the book?
I'm sorry, tell me again.
Is there anything you would like to change about the book?
Oh, things you'd like to change about the book. Well, it's too late now. Although, this is a hardback. This was published in April. There will be a paperback edition of it coming out, and I can change things in the paperback. So there are a couple of small errors. You write a big book like this, and you're not going to get every fact right. I'm very, very careful about it, and it infuriates me when I make a mistake. There are a couple things that have been caught in here, and I will fix those minor errors for the paperback. Otherwise, I don't think so. I don't think I would change the narrative. I don't think I would change the structure. For one thing, it's behind me. I'm done. It's a lot, as you can imagine, to write a book like this. This and the first book in the trilogy each took me 6 years. And I'm pretty careful when I start out to be sure that I'm going to write the book that I want to write. Pretty careful in how I organize. When I'm finished the research, I do all the research first, 3 years of research in libraries and archives and reading other books and so on. The first thing I do is make a big outline. Everything that I've written from the time I became a cub newspaper reporter when I was 22, I always make an outline. I think it's critical for anything you're writing. And it can be as simple as, I'm going to do this first and then this and then this. Well, for a book like this, the outline took me 7 months. The outline is 600,000 words. I use the outlining software on Word, on a computer. And so that allows me to think through what the book is going to be. It also provides me with a map when I sit down to actually start writing. And that's really important, to have a map. And that's what an outline is. It's a map for you. And in my case, I also put where the information is that I'm going to use when I'm writing to make it easy to find so I'm not fumbling around. So that's a long-winded answer to say, no, I don't think so.
How much time researching did it take you to write?
Lily, is it? Yeah, thank you. I spend about 3 years researching each of these books, and I put a mark on the calendar when I'm going to stop researching, because you can wander into the woods and never wander out. You can research forever, and that's not good. And I know that when I get to the end of that 3-year period, there'll be things I don't know, things I didn't get to. And you have to be comfortable with ambiguity at some point. And people behind me will be writing about this subject, and maybe they'll get to it at some point. So, but when I finish the research, and there's basically 2 kinds of information when you're writing history. There are primary sources. Those are diaries and letters, accounts written by people who were involved in the events of the time, records from that time. And then there's secondary sources, and this library is full of secondary sources. And those are books and magazine articles and so on that have been written about that event, or biographies, other histories, and so on. And so during the 3-year period, I'm working both of those piles of information. So I go to archives in London, for example, a lot. I go to archives places like the New York Historical Society, which has a lot of stuff. There are about 20 archives and libraries that I use. So at the end of the 3 years, then it's time to get down to brass tacks, and that is to write the book.
So you're speaking my language now with all the research and time in libraries. And these guys are very familiar with primary and secondary because each week you guys do a primary document, right? In social studies, where you're looking at a primary document and responding to that. So
That's great.
so they've got some good experience in what that means. So, all right, who has the next question? All right, let's go Henry in the back row there. Hold your hand up, Henry, so she knows who she's going to. There you go.
Why was the tea so important to the British?
Why was the tea so important to the British? It wasn't the tea was important because they made a lot of money on it. The tea came mostly from China, so it's come all the way around the world to get to Boston, for example. And there was a company called the East India Company that was responsible for getting the tea from the growers and transmitting it all the way around the world to Britain, first of all. Mostly Scottish merchants involved in the tea trade, and then to transmit it by ship to America. So they're making lots of money off of it. Now the real money is in the West Indies, because that's where the sugar's grown, sugar cane. And it's basically slave-driven, 10 slaves to every white overseer and plantation owner in the West Indies. And we're talking about all those islands in the West Indies, Jamaica being the most important to the British in the 18th century. And they're making enormous amounts of money on sugar. The British and all Europeans have a huge sweet tooth. And sugar is also used to make molasses, and molasses is used to make rum. And a lot of that production is in New England and New York. And again, big money. So besides the money that they're making off of these products, for the British, tea is important because it becomes a symbol of Britain's right to impose taxes on the colonies. The King, George III, and Parliament, two houses of Parliament, the House of Lords and the House of Commons, believe that the colonies, including the 13 American colonies, Ireland, Canada, India, they owned parts of India at that time, must obey Parliament, must acknowledge the right of Parliament to impose taxes. And so when the Americans say, we don't think so, we're not going to pay taxes, we're not going to acknowledge that we are subservient to Parliament, this becomes an issue. They go to war over it. So that's why it's important.
So before we ask another question, so just hold your questions for a second. I want to just talk a little bit about what today is all about and why Mr. Atkinson is here on this day, because it is significant that this afternoon there's going to be a reenactment at Beach Road, so right down the street here at 3 o'clock. They're going to reenact Henry Knox's landing. So could you just tell us a little bit about Henry Knox's landing and what that signifies?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, how many of you have heard of Henry Knox? Yeah, well, most of you. Well, Henry Knox, in 1775, when the American Revolution begins, is 25 years old. He is a bookseller in Boston, where he grew up. And he's got a shop, and he sells not only books, but other things too. bookshops tended to be kind of like Barnes and Noble today. You can go in and buy stuff other than books in Barnes and Noble. So Henry Knox is not particularly well educated. He's been to the equivalent of high school, but he's largely self-taught, and he loves books. But he also loves being part of the local militia, meaning about once a week he goes out and practices with other men, and he's an artilleryman. He learns how to fire cannons, and he's really good at it. He's really good at math, which is important when you're an artilleryman. You got to know something about the trajectory of the cannonballs and so on. You got to understand trigonometry, basic algebra and so on. He's good at it. So when the war begins in April 1775, he becomes an artilleryman. And George Washington, who arrives outside of Boston in July 1775 to take command of the new Continental Army, looks around and sees this guy. He's hard to miss because he's enormous. He's not as tall as Washington, who's almost 6'3", at a time when the average American man is maybe 5'7". Knox is tall, he's 6 foot, but by the end of the war he's going to weigh 300 pounds. But he has the capacity to not only learn how to fire the guns, but he's going to, there he is. You can see, this is a picture of him later in life. You can see he's a pretty jowly guy. He's a wonderful character. So Washington and the army have the British stuck in Boston, but they can't get them out. The British are well entrenched. They have a lot of artillery, and they have the Royal Navy going in and out of Boston Harbor, the greatest navy the world's ever seen. So Washington says to Henry Knox, this 25-year-old guy, I know that there's some guns at Fort Ticonderoga that the British have abandoned when Fort Ticonderoga at the south end of Lake Champlain was captured at the beginning of the Revolution. And their guns are still there. Why don't you go and see if you can bring some back? Because what I need are big guns. I need big cannons to blow the British out of Boston. So it's 300 miles from Boston to Fort Ticonderoga. It's the middle of the winter. And Knox, with a group of men, they make their way to Fort Ticonderoga. They're waiting for it to snow because they need snow because they're going to transport these big guns. They weigh 1 ton to 2 tons each on sleds across the snow down Lake George. They're coming right through here. It's very historic where you live. Come right through here, and then they're going to turn to the east. They're going to go through the Berkshires in Massachusetts and get back to Boston. And it takes a couple of months. It's an extraordinary feat. It's really hard with oxen and horses pulling those big guns up and down hills, pretty steep in the Berkshires, pretty steep around here, as you know. He gets back to Cambridge outside of Boston, and he reports to Washington and says, Boss, I'm back. I brought you more than 50 guns. And Washington says, you are my man. And those guns are taken up on the high ground around Boston, and the British wake up in the morning, and there are lots of cannons looking right down, and the cannons begin firing on British positions in Boston, and the British have to leave Boston. They leave March 17th, 1776. They're driven out of Boston by the guns that Henry Knox has brought through here back to Washington's army. He remains Washington's artillery chief through the whole war. He's a really important figure. And then he's going to be, after the war, when Washington becomes president, he serves 2 terms as president, Henry Knox is the first Secretary of War. He runs the military for Washington in the 1780s. So
we have time for probably one more question. So I saw your hand go up first. So yep, we'll go ahead right to the back row there.
If you were to dive down in like the Boston Harbor, could you find a tea bag?
No. First of all, the tea is not in bags, like the kind you buy in the store today. It's loose. It's in big crates. And part of what they were doing when they had the Boston Tea Party was prying open the crates with crowbars and hatchets, breaking open some of them with hatchets, and dumping the tea into the harbor. So there were no tea bags. The tea would have dissolved fairly quickly. Boston Harbor has tides coming in and out. I mean, there is tea washing up on the banks of Boston Harbor for days afterwards, because 40 tons is a lot of tea. But you would not find any remnant of the tea itself. The crates that it came in, I'm sure, were used for firewood afterward. The 3 ships, which were British ships that had brought the tea over, were allowed to leave. So they were not destroyed. When the king got word of what had happened in Boston Harbor, George III, your last king, he was furious. He's a usually pretty even-tempered guy, but what George then says is, blows must decide, meaning we're going to come to war over this. The Tea Party in particular, there had been a lot of events leading up to it that had irked both sides, but it's the Tea Party that really is a precipitating event in causing moving the British and the Americans toward the war that begins in April 1775.
All right. So obviously the Tea Party is a high on everybody's minds. That's a big conversation. And we talk about the causes of the American Revolution, so that gets a lot of attention from these guys. So
why don't we give Mr. Atkinson a thank you and applause.
Thank you.
today is a special opportunity to hear from an author, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. So, and to hear about a topic that is also very connected locally. So the kind of timing of this visit is because we're celebrating Henry Knox's arrival and during the American Revolution here on Lake George with the cannons and artillery. So that you'll be hearing some more about today, and there's the opportunity if you wanted to see that reenactment at 3 o'clock this afternoon at Beach Road. That will be kind of an interesting experience. But kind of leading up to that, we're going to get to hear from Mr. Atkinson about his writing process, and you'll get an opportunity to ask some of your questions. So if you want to just start off, give us a little intro to how you've gotten to where you are in your writing.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Olson. Thanks, kids, for having me here today. What a great school. It's a beautiful school that you're attending. I live in the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., so I'm grateful to be up here to see snow. We don't get much of that in Washington, and you get plenty of it here. So I have all of my professional life been a writer. I started on a small newspaper out of graduate school in southeast Kansas, and I worked there for about 1.5 years, and then I went to a bigger newspaper in Kansas City, and I worked there for 4 years, and then I went to Washington and ultimately to the Washington Post, and I worked there for almost 20 years as a reporter, as an editor, as a foreign correspondent, as a war correspondent. My last job there was running investigative reporting at the Washington Post. At the Post, twice I took leaves of absence for 1.5 years each time to write books because that's what I really wanted to do. I loved newspapers and I loved newsrooms, but what I really wanted to do was to write narrative history. The first book that I wrote, it was published in 1989, was called The Long Gray Line. It was about the West Point class of 1966, which was singular only because they lost more men, and West Point at that time was all men. There were no women admitted to West Point until 1976. They lost more men in Vietnam than any other class. 30 of them were killed in Vietnam. And many other things happened to them, both at West Point and afterward, that made them worthy of using them as a way to tell a 25-year history of American social history, what happened to America during and after the war, which I could tell that story through them. And then I took another leave of absence and wrote a book about the Persian Gulf War. I'd been the main writer for the Post when that war was happening in 1990 and 91. And then I went to Berlin, and I lived in Berlin as the Washington Post bureau chief in Berlin for several years. And I was in Bosnia, I was in Somalia 3 times, which was the nastiest place I've ever been in terms of danger. I've been to Iraq, Afghanistan. And when I came back from the Post and ran investigative reporting, I thought, this is 1998, okay, now it's time to pull the ripcord. Let's move on. So I left my day job to write books full-time. I wanted to write about World War II in particular because it's the biggest thing that happened in the 20th century. It had enormous impact on America, on the world, on who we are today, and it was very, very dramatic. And I wanted to tell the story of the American role in the liberation of Europe in World War II, and that story can be told in 3 different panels, starting in North Africa, which is where the liberation of Europe began, the Americans and British invading North Africa, taking North Africa back from the Axis powers, and then moving north across the Mediterranean to Sicily and Italy, and then to Western Europe beginning in Normandy in 1944. So it's a triptych, it's 3 panels to tell that story. And then to get where we are today, the last of those 3 books was published in 2013, and even before it was published, I was thinking of Jack London's advice that a writer ought not wait for inspiration, but ought to light out after it with a club. And so I took my club, and what I found was the American Revolution, which interested me since I was a kid. I'm an Army brat, so I moved around a lot. I was born in Germany, but I moved and followed my father of necessity to many different Army posts. So I've always been interested in the military, but I've been particularly interested in the American Revolution because it's where we started. It's our origin story, sometimes our origin myth. And it tells us something about who we are, where we came from, what our forebears believed, and what they were willing to die for. That's the most profound question any people can ask themselves. What were they willing to die for? Why were they willing to die for it? So I've taken up another trilogy. I'm 2/3 of the way through. First book was published in 2019 called The British Are Coming. This book, The Fate of the Day, was published in April. It was #1 on the Times bestseller list. I've been very involved with Ken Burns for the last 4 years. He has a new film out, aired on PBS last month on the American Revolution. So we can talk about that if you want. I will see him again on Tuesday. We're going to the French Embassy together in Washington because the French are showing part of his film. And then he and I are having a conversation on stage. So I've got one more book to go. Each of these books has taken me about 6 years. And we can talk about the process. I do most of the research myself because it has to go through my eyes and my brain somehow to really stick. Some people have teams of researchers. I don't do that. So I'm figuring the 3rd book is going to be another 6 years. And then I'd like to retire. But we'll see whether that happens. Okay, that's enough. Now we'll hear from you guys. Tell me your name, too.
I'm Ella Montville. If you could interview one person from the Revolutionary War era, who would it be and why?
Yeah, that's a great question. The New York Times asked me if I threw a dinner party and could invite 3 people, living or dead, who would the 3 people be? The first person I would invite would be Benjamin Franklin. And the reason for that, I wouldn't, Washington, I would like to talk to Washington. I have a lot of questions for Washington because he's not as good a general as he should have been. Or Henry Knox. Today you're going to commemorate Henry Knox's great feat of bringing those cannons from Ticonderoga through here, through this town, all the way to Boston. But Franklin, first of all, he in the time of the Revolution in the 1770s, he's the most famous American. And he's famous because of his scientific discoveries. You know that he did experiments with electricity. They're words we use today like battery and voltage and positive and minus, positive and negative, that come from Franklin. So he is very well known. He's got an honorary doctorate from Oxford, and he has done a number of things leading up to the late fall of 1776 on behalf of the Revolution, on behalf of the Continental Congress. He's a member of Congress. But he's sent as a diplomat to Paris. He's in his 70s, which is really old in those days, and he's crossing the Atlantic. He's going to cross the Atlantic 12 times in the course of his life, and that is really hard in those days. Takes sometimes months. So he's sent to Paris because he is going to be our first, and as it turns out, our greatest diplomat. He's going to try to persuade the French king, Louis XVI, who's a Roman Catholic, absolute monarch. He doesn't have to pay any attention to Congress. He doesn't have to pay any attention to state governments. He is an absolute monarch. When what he says is law. Try to persuade Louis and the French court at Versailles, just outside of Paris, that it's in their best interest to align with Protestant, wannabe Republicans, intent on armed rebellion against their lawful monarch. That's a heavy lift diplomatically. And he's brilliant at it. He's incredibly patient. He uses his fame, and when he arrives in Paris, he's wearing this kind of ratty marten skin cap that he got in Canada when he'd been on another diplomatic mission. And soon all the beautiful women in Paris are wearing faux marten skin caps on top of their 3-foot bouffant hairdo. Everybody in Paris who's anybody has little busts of Franklin on their mantles. He has his picture painted over and over again. People run after his coach when he's going through Paris. He uses this fame to good effect because he uses it as a lever with the French court to show how popular the American cause is both in the aristocracy and among ordinary people in France. So he's going to be successful. He's going to persuade the king. After the Battle of Saratoga, not far from here, leads to the destruction of a British army that has come down Lake Champlain and down Lake George into the Hudson River Valley, and they run into trouble. And that army, 8,000 men, British, German, and Canadian, is destroyed. And that persuades Louis XVI, the French king, these people can do it. They can do it. They're sticking it to the British, our hereditary enemies. We will do what Franklin and the American Congress want us to do. We'll send an army and a navy. We'll help them. And it's the difference maker. We don't win. It's going to take a while, but we don't win our independence in 1783. 8 years of war without the French. So that's a long-winded answer because I get to talk about one of my favorite people.
What is it like to win a Pulitzer Prize?
Oh, thanks. Well, I've had the good fortune, good luck, it's luck, to win 3. The first time I was 29, I was working for the newspaper in Kansas City. It was a complete surprise to me. I won for national reporting, partly on the basis of a newspaper series I'd written about that West Point class of 1966, which later turned into a book. Does it change your life? Not really. I got good advice from the guy who was my boss in Kansas City, and he said, don't try and think you need to win it again tomorrow. Just do your job. Get up and do your job. And I took that to heart, and that's what I did. It probably got me a job at the Washington Post because it separated me from the great pack of very capable journalists a bit. So that was important. I was ahead of a small team, 7 people. We won in 1999 the gold medal, which is considered the best of the Pulitzers, the most revered of the Pulitzers, because it's for public service. And for a year, I directed an investigation into bad shootings by Washington, D.C. cops. Bad shootings meaning they were shooting people they shouldn't have been shooting. And we proved it. And we got, it led to enormous reforms in the D.C. Police Department, in the way police were trained, in the way they learned how to use Glocks, the pistols that they were using, in the accountability, and so on. I'm very proud of that one. The third time I was in Iraq during the invasion of 2003, between books. I'd gone with then Major General David Petraeus, who was the new commander of the 101st Airborne Division. And Petraeus had agreed to take me along with him when they left Fort Campbell, Kentucky. I flew with him to Kuwait. And then when the war began in February of 2003, with the American invasion of Iraq, I was with Petraeus every day, all day long, either in the Humvee next to him or in the Black Hawk helicopter next to him, living with the soldiers, living the life. It was very hard living. And we were outside Najaf, this little Shiite town south of Baghdad, and I was on the satellite phone to the Home Office, the Washington Post, and the executive editor, Len Downey, came on the phone and said, "We want you to know, we just learned you won the Pulitzer Prize for History for An Army at Dawn," which was the first book that I wrote about World War II. It's surreal. It's an 8-hour time difference from Iraq to Washington. It's midnight in the camp. Everybody is asleep except for the people who are on duty around the perimeter of the camp. There are flares going up watching for infiltrators. The only person awake at that time was a lieutenant. His name was Eric Lake, I remember. He was not much older than you all are. And he was watching The Simpsons on TV, because these guys can get anything off the satellite. He was watching The Simpsons. He's the duty officer. So I went in and I said, "Eric, I got to tell somebody. I just learned I won the Pulitzer Prize for History." He turns away from The Simpsons and says, "That's nice," and goes back to the Simpsons, which was exactly the right reaction. So that's what it was like. And then I went on with it, and there was a lot of violence in the next few days, and Pulitzer Prize, I'm mainly trying to save my butt at that point. So thanks for the question.
Were you interested in history as a kid? And if so, what were your earliest influences in media, like books and movies?
Yeah. I was interested in history, partly because we were moving all the time, and it was, every couple of years or less, it was a new place. I was more interested in literature, and I studied English in college. I studied English literature in graduate school. I thought I wanted to teach college English. The job market was terrible. It's still terrible. It was really terrible then. And so instead of going on to get a PhD, I left after getting a master's degree and ended up, by chance, working on this small paper in southeast Kansas, the Pittsburgh Morning Sun. Not that Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh without the H on the end, a town of 20,000. And I found that I really loved newspapers. I loved the people that journalism attracted. I was really taken with the cause of what journalism could do. So I kind of put history aside a bit. I hadn't studied it. I had to, when I began writing particularly the World War II books, which are real history, I had to, first of all, find out whether I was an archive rat. And I am, meaning, do you like going in and working with primary sources for days, weeks, months at a time? The mystery of the next unopened archival box is what gets me up in the morning. And that's really important for doing, what I do. I had to teach myself historiography to some extent, meaning the study of history. I fully subscribe to all the edicts of the academy, meaning universities. There are, 200 pages of back matter in this doorstop. That's the notes, that's the bibliography, my explanation of things. There's not a fact in here that you can't find sourced in the back of this. All of the history books I do are that way because that's the way it needs to be. I do it in part to inoculate myself against academic historians. I'm looking over my shoulder at them, but I also believe in it. So I've become a historian, not because I'd studied it, not because I was passionate about it. I remember reading Johnny Tremain when I was, probably in junior high then. It's, a fictional book about a kid in the Revolution. That really got my imagination. And my job as a narrative writer is to provoke the reader's imagination so that you see it, you hear it, you smell it, and it all has to be grounded in the historical record. I can't make it up. I can't say her eyes were green when in fact they were blue. I can't say they turned left when in fact they turned right. That's a slippery slope. That's fiction. And you can't profess to be a historian if you're writing fiction, not even a little bit. So that's a challenge. So yeah, thanks for the good question.
After researching and considering all of the information you have learned about, what historical figures, concepts, or events do you think are misunderstood the most?
Vanessa, is it? Is that your name? Aubrey, I'm sorry. Aubrey. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we look back on the American Revolution and we have kind of this gauzy, faded lithograph view of it, right? And it wasn't like that. It was incredibly violent. It's our first civil war. 20% of the 2 million white Americans, and by the way, 1 out of every 5 Americans at that time, 500,000, are enslaved blacks. But of the white Americans, about 20% are loyal to the crown. They are against armed rebellion against their lawful monarch. Tens of thousands of them take up arms and fight for the king. So it is a real civil war, and it gets nastier as the revolution goes on, as all civil wars are. It's brother on brother, father against son. That's something I think many people don't really understand. It's a civil war in other respects too. Nothing good happens to the Indians as a consequence of the American Revolution. Probably the most affected are here in New York State, the 6 nations of the Iroquois. They've been getting along really well with each other for 100 years or more, and they have to choose sides when the revolution starts. And 4 of those tribes, 4 of those nations, including the Mohawk, align with the British, 2 align with the rebels, with the Americans, and it becomes a civil war for the Indians. And after the war, nothing good happens for them. And nothing good has happened during the war for them. So that's one thing. There's a lot of mythology about the founders. George Washington is a pretty indifferent tactician. He makes a lot of mistakes on the battlefield. When he takes command of the Continental Army outside of Boston in July of 1775, he's had 5 years of military experience as a Virginia militia colonel, always under superior British command during the French and Indian War, but he's been out of uniform for 16 years. He's been running his plantation at Mount Vernon. Incidentally, during his lifetime at Mount Vernon, he owned at least 577 slaves. You can't square that circle morally. It's immoral. That's part of who we are as a people. It's not the whole story, and he's got many other attributes, and I revere him, but that's an important part of understanding who we are and where we came from. And the foundation of this country's prosperity is on slavery. So that part of the story, I think, is not well understood. Nothing good happens for the slaves during the Revolution, with very few exceptions. They're caught between both sides. The British in particular offer freedom to slaves if they will come and fight for them. Nothing enrages the Southern planters more than that offer from the British to free slaves, because it threatens their whole way of life in the South. There's slavery in all 13 states, including New York. There are thousands of slaves in New York. That's something I think that's not particularly well understood. None of that is to suggest that the American Revolution, the founders, all of the things that we derive from that is not wonderful. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. That's a profound thought, and it affects not only what this country becomes, it affects the world. And it's aspirational. It's what we're hoping for. We're still working on it, right? 250 years later, and we have come a long way since then, both in size, 338 million people now compared to 2.5 million, in opportunity, in the rights for women, for minorities, for indigents, and so on. All of that is part of what we have been building on since then. It is a really great story. It's something to be proud of. It's something to cherish. It's something to embrace. And we're relying on you all to make it better. It's a big job. We're relying on you to make it better. Okay.